Between Me and You. Patrick Fyffe in character, today as Molly Mandred in Twice Around the Lupins.
I can't honestly say what made me go there today, but since we moved away all those years ago, well, I just got out of the habit. But you sometimes get a feeling that things are planned, don't you? Meant to happen. Like I was meant to go there today. At first I thought it might have been seeing the advert in Saturday evening's paper. Memorials, it said. And there was this big picture of an angel holding a lily. Or perhaps it was seeing the packets of lupin seeds in Woolworths yesterday. Yes, it might have been that. Be about 9, I suppose, when I discovered that Mother didn't like them. We were in the garden and she was planting out, as she put it. I remember going over to this little bed of blue flowers under the laburnum tree and saying how pretty they were. "Oh, I can't stand them," she said. "Horrible things, lupins. I've never liked them." And she gave a little shudder as if it had suddenly turned cold. "Horrible things," she said. "There was a whole bed of them by that wall, and I'd have had them all pulled up but for your father. I left that one root just for him. He liked the colour." And so did I. I thought it was ever so pretty. In fact, I can remember sliding my hand very slowly right up the stem of one of them, right to the top, where the little blue flower cases get smaller and smaller until they just become a tiny grey dot. I don't think Mother ever told me why she didn't like them, but she didn't. That day she just carried on planting out a box of nemesias that she'd reared in the greenhouse from a packet of seeds. "Now, these are what I call pretty flowers," she said. "Look at their little faces, all different colours, all smiling up at you, just like pansies do." She loved pansies. And very pretty they were, but not as pretty as lupins to me. Mother never understood it. "You take after your father," she'd say. "He likes lupins. I can't think why." Mine, they did agree about roses and carnations. As far back as I can remember, he always gave Mother a dozen carnations on her birthday and a dozen roses on their wedding anniversary. Every year without fail, even when they weren't speaking. Right opposite to where we used to live was the old lodge that had once belonged to a much bigger house. Dufton Lodge it was called. There was a family called the Kennets lived there, and before them a couple called Ryerson, who'd bought it from the staple force. These people were only names to me. They'd moved from our road long before I came on the scene. But I loved to hear my mother talk about them, so much so that even though I'd never met them, I felt I knew them intimately. Anyway, the Ryersons had an old gardener, Mr. Morris his name was, and it seems one day when Father was away on business, he called on Mother and told her the Ryersons were leaving and he'd be out of a job. So, was there any work she'd like doing around the place? Well, she'd jumped at the chance, and she asked him to get rid of all the lupins, apart from one root by the laburnum tree, and she wanted him to plant her some roses and a few lilies of the valley. "Your wish is my command, madam," is what he'd said to my mother, and she used to pull her glasses down on the bridge of her nose at this point and do an impression of Mr. Morris. I don't know whether it was a good one or not, but it made me laugh. Anyway, when Father arrived back home, there'd been a big bonfire and practically all the lupins had gone, and in their place was a new rose bed. No, she never did tell me why she didn't like lupins, but she didn't. In fact, one of the last things I remember her saying when she had to take to her bed, "I hope when I die, Molly, there aren't any lupins in the churchyard, and for God's sake, don't let them bury me up against a wall. You know I'm a bit claustrophobic. Oh, and another thing, no church bells. I can't stand the sound of church bells. Always remind me of funerals." That surprised me, that did, about the church bells. I've always loved the sound myself. Whenever I visit my daughter and her family, I like to take the children for walks along the lanes and bridle paths. And if there's a church open, I like to just go and stand in the porch and look up at the great bell rope hanging there, stretching away up to the loft where the bell sits on its cradle, all hidden from view. When Mother died, a few weeks before her 85th, she went very peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by flowers. It was my job to make all the arrangements, being the only one close to hand at the time. And I like to think I was as meticulous in every detail as I know she would have wished, even going as far as to check that there were none of the offending flowers in the vicinity of what was to be her final resting place. Mind, when you think you've got everything sorted out, there's always something, isn't there? The day before the funeral, I had a frantic call from the priest. "Mrs. Mandred," he said, "bad news, I'm afraid. We won't be able to bury your mother in our churchyard. Apparently there'd been a bit of subsidence during the night, old mine workings or something, and so they thought it safer to bury her in St. Bede's churchyard a couple of miles away. And they hoped that I would understand." Well, of course I did. After all, if it had happened while we were all gathered at the graveside, we might have all gone down the hole together. So that was it. Mother was to be buried at St. Bede's. It was a lovely little service, just as she would have wished, no fuss. Beautiful flowers, too. Mine were a dozen carnations in assorted colours with a little bit of fern, just like Father had always given her. And that's another thing. Mother had always tried, without success, to strike a cutting from the fern. "I don't know why," she would say. "Your grandfather could always grow it. It grew for him, but it won't grow for me." Anyway, as Mother was carried out into the sunlight and placed onto the bier that was to transport her on her last little journey, that's when it happened. The one thing I'd forgotten to mention when we moved the funeral to St. Bede's, the church bell. Well, we'd hardly left the porch when it started. Dong it went. Dong! Oh, it was deafening. I had to look round to see what the others might be thinking. I couldn't help myself, but nobody seemed bothered. In fact, I heard somebody saying, "Good old Tommy, you can always rely on Tommy to ring a good funeral bell. Only trot him out for funerals nowadays. He's too old for weddings, can't manage the full peal." Dong, dong, and on it went. Oh, I'd have given anything to have it stopped. And just as I was about to put my finger in my ears, I felt a hand very lightly on my arm. It was the young priest, and he told me that old Tommy had come out specially that day to ring the bell because he'd remembered his father, telling him about a Mrs. Felton who'd lived at the big house and who'd given him the odd gardening job. So old Tommy was Mr. Morris's son. Well, in the circumstances, I thought I'd better turn a deaf ear to the bell. When we arrived at the graveside, all the new earth had been turned over that morning and heaped up at the side. And would you believe, right up against a big stone wall. And there they were, lupins, hundreds of them, all colours. My son, who was holding on to my arm, said, "It'll be a lovely spot for Grandma, won't it?" And I said, "No, it won't. She hated damn lupins. She couldn't stand the sight of the damn things." And I felt a tear slide down my cheek. "Oh, I'm sorry, Mother," I said. "I did try, honestly, I did. I did so want to get it right for you, just like you always wanted it." Of course, that's 20 years ago now. And as I said, apart from the first year or two, I've not been back there until today. Well, I hardly recognise the place. St. Bede's look much the same, but then churches always do, don't they? But the churchyard, I didn't know where I was. I couldn't get my bearings at all. And Mother's grave. I don't know what I'd have done if I hadn't bumped into this elderly gentleman by the church gate. From what he said, he did a bit of work in the churchyard. Anyway, when I told him I couldn't find Mother's grave, he asked me how long it was since I'd buried her. When I told him 20 years, he said, "Oh, she'll be near where the old wall was." And he pointed, over there beyond the yew tree. Well, it all looked so different from what I remembered. Anyhow, as we were walking over, he told me how, when he'd first gone to work there, everything had been let go, and how he'd been told to level the ground out so that all they'd need to do would be to run a mower between the graves, and any broken gravestones to stack them up against the wall. Well, he'd done everything like they told him to, but the old wall was too weak to take the weight of all the stones up against it, and it just collapsed. I think that's what it was, you know. Why I couldn't find the grave. I was looking for that wall. Anyway, he went on telling me how he dug up this bed of lupins and burnt them all. Oh, horrible things, he said. And you know, since I got rid of those, there's all this funny fern stuff that started to grow. Don't know where it's come from, but it's not unattractive and it makes a nice screen in the summer. I said perhaps the birds had dropped some seeds, and he agreed with me. And then suddenly I saw Mother's grave. Oh, and it was so pretty, completely surrounded by roses. And I said to him, "Who's done that? Who's planted all those roses on my mother's grave?" I think he was a bit upset because he said, "What's the matter, don't you like them?" And I told him, "Oh, they're lovely. I just wondered who was responsible so that I could say thank you. You know how you do." Then he told me it was his son who was a gardener and hoped to own his own nursery one day, and how he thought that they ought to keep one area for flowers. Then he told me all the roses were called Peace. Well, of course I knew that, because we had them at home. They were Mother's favourites. And he's thinking of planting a few carnations at the back end. The old gentleman thought that was a bit ambitious. But I told him, well, they might do rather well. Anyway, he could see I was anxious to get on, so he said he'd leave me to put my flowers in the vase, and it was all right to use a bit of wild fern if I wanted. I wouldn't be accused of stealing. He gave a little laugh and off he went. Funny little laugh he had. But I was ever so grateful to him. I took my vase over to the tap and I filled it with water, and I went back to the grave and I picked some of the fern, and I didn't feel too guilty as I'd been given permission, you know. And it was while I was arranging that with the carnations that I got the feeling I wasn't alone. I turned round, and there was this young man standing there staring down at me. Ooh, he'd be about 30, I suppose, very friendly looking. "Hello," he said. "Haven't seen you here before. One of your relatives, is it?" And I told him it was my mother's grave, and I asked him if he was the one responsible for looking after it so nicely. And he said, "Oh, you approve then?" And I said, "Oh, I did, yes." "Oh," he said, "well, that's all right then. My name's Tom, and I'm Molly Mandred," I said. And he thrust his hand out, and I got all tied up with my gloves and handbag, like you do, you know, and we laughed. Then he told me how his father had looked after the churchyard until his death, and then how he'd taken over and decided on the changes. "Oh," I said. "What happened to your father then? When did he die?" And he told me about this freak accident 15 years ago. It seems his grandfather had been the bell ringer at St. Bede's for years. And when he died, the young man's father thought he could take over, and he was preparing for his first funeral up in the loft, putting the muffler on the bell, when he slipped and cracked his skull on it. "Oh, dear," I said. "Oh, how sad." "So there's just you here on your own then? No one else with you?" "That's right," he said. "There's only me." Well, I didn't know what to think, let alone say. I mean, it was a very funny feeling, I can tell you. It was all I could do to stop myself shaking. "Well," I said, I think I'd better be on my way now. It's been very nice meeting you, and maybe one day I'll see you again." "Oh, I hope so," he said. "And I'm delighted that you like what I've done to your mother's grave. Oh, and by the way, I'm thinking of planting carnations at the back end. Do you think your mother would approve?" And I said, "Oh, she'd approve. She'd love them." While he was walking me to the gates, he said, "What do you think of lupins?" "Oh, I'm very fond of lupins," I said, "but not for here. No, they wouldn't be right here. Everything's just lovely the way it is."
That was Twice Around the Lupins, written and presented by Patrick Fyffe, in character today as Molly Mandred. Between Me and You was produced by John Fawcett Wilson.